Good evening, everyone. I am Mark Hoffman. I will be talking tonight about Chapter 10. It is upon the topics in business ethics of whistleblowing as well as loyalty. I will be covering the first half of the chapter, which is on whistleblowing, and then David Way will be covering the second half, which is on loyalty. So to start off the chapter, we start with Cecilia Bach. Cecilia Bach goes into talking about whistleblowing and professional responsibility. She defines whistleblowing as the act of sounding an alarm from within the very organization in which one works to spotlight neglect or abuses that threaten the public interest. She also goes into talking about the three elements that have specific consideration while whistleblowing. These are dissent, loyalty, and accusation. So she goes on to speak about individual moral choice, and she defines individual moral choice as having these three elements. So covering dissent, the idea of dissent is to benefit the public, and any form of whistleblowing can be considered dissent because it is going against your own company. Dissent, it is only really to prevent harm to persons or institutions in the public's interest. It's not really for personal gain, and that's why dissent takes specific consideration in the act of whistleblowing. Whistleblowing should only be used as the last alternative after someone exercises all possible avenues for change within the organization. So when someone does whistleblow, it is seen as a breach of loyalty because you may be loyal to your company, you may have taken an oath. So when you make an accusation in the act of whistleblowing, you're not supposed to go into someone's private matters. Of course, this goes back to what we covered in previous chapters, which is the public's right to know something. So if someone's private matters are a threat to the public, then it is almost essential that they're exposed. So with that comes the strong possibility that there's going to be some bias, and that's where people may look into if there's going to be a bias, skewing their message, such as someone made an accusation out of self-defense, if someone was seeking revenge, if maybe they had inflated expectations of what was going to happen, or they may or may not seek personal gain from making this accusation. They need to have sought as much and as objective advice as possible regarding their choice. The second is that they need to be aware of the arguments for and against whistleblowing, about the organizational context of whistleblowing, and what makes it morally problematic. A few things, such as one can only blow the whistle on his or her own organization. They can only reveal information which they've been entrusted, so you have to work for the company to say, hey, this is our information, don't reveal it to anyone. And they don't really reveal the information to save their own skin. It's more or less for the public interest. The standard theory states that disloyalty is morally permissible when several reasons. When an organization will do serious or considerable harm to the public, when the threat of harm is identified, reported to a supervisor, and the threat is made clear in itself and its objection, and the superior will basically do nothing effective to stop it. When an employee has exhausted all of their internal procedures, like I said, within the organization to make this possible hazard preventable, and the evidence which can conceive a reasonable, impartial observer that the threat is correct. So basically that anyone can see that, oh my gosh, something needs to be done, otherwise something bad is going to happen. People have a moral obligation to prevent serious harm to others. A minimally decent Samaritan basically does what is morally required of society. A good Samaritan goes well above and beyond what their moral minimum is. The first paradox that he finds in the standard theory is the paradox of burden. Now he says that whistleblowers cannot be minimally decent Samaritans because they always take risk that's well beyond what is morally required. That's the paradox of burden. The paradox of missing harm goes into talking about how blowing the whistle seeks to prevent considerable harm, which makes it morally permissible, but brings into question what is harm. Is it physical, financial, psychological, which are the main three we think of? Others can deem it as something as simple as injustice or deception. So there's this big paradox of missing harm, which is it's almost impossible to define how much harm deems someone to blow the whistle. The third is the paradox of failure. The paradox of failure agrees with the second, which is the prevention of harm, in the fact that blowing the whistle is out to prevent harm, but many or much of the time it does not actually prevent harm itself. It just raises awareness. It doesn't really always get the job done. The complicity theory. The complicity theory is, in essence, talking about how not only are whistleblowers generally deeply involved in the activity that they reveal, so they are a worker for a company, they are doing something, and they feel that it's wrong, and they're calling out their own company in the area they work, but they have an obligation to derive the complicity in the wrongdoing rather than the ability to prevent harm. So, in essence, this has two advantages because it avoids the paradox of missing harm, because it's looking at the purposes of the moral wrongdoing and not necessarily the harm that's being done, as well as it invokes a morally demanding obligation than the ability to prevent harm. So, slightly harder to understand, but it is basically saying that it's telling or calling out workers to be more morally obligated to avoid doing morally wrong things. And if we find ourselves engaged in something wrong, we have an obligation to do what's reasonably right and set things right in the end. So not to blow the whistle, but to just fix it ourselves and do the right thing. So the only things that would really require someone to reveal to the public that something's going wrong is if what you reveal derives from your work for your organization, if you're a voluntary member of that organization, or if you believe your organization is engaged in something seriously morally wrong and your work is contributing to that. Sorry, one sec. If your work personally is contributing to the moral wrong that your company is committing, then you have to go public with it. But the complicity theory is, in essence, saying, if you know you're doing something wrong, then fix it. So he goes on to talk about the differences between the standard theory and the complicity theory, but I'm not going to really go into that because you can obviously tell that there's a difference. One is more or less saying, complicity theory is saying you should do right instead of calling the whistle, and the other is basically justifying why you should. Third, we're going to move on to Ronald Duska. Ronald Duska talks about whistleblowing and employee loyalty. 3 topics he covers is he tries to define whistleblowing, and he tries to deem when it's permissible, and debates when someone has the obligation to blow the whistle on their own company. So Ronald Duska touches on other different authors like Norman Bowie. Norman Bowie, he thinks there's a duty of loyalty that prohibits one from reporting their own employer because they have a loyalty to their company. But there's times when there's such thing called prima facie, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, prima facie duty, which is one that can be overridden by a higher duty to the public good. So he believes that you should never call out your own company for doing something wrong, but there's times when if it's going to harm the public, it's necessary. So Ronald Duska is failing to see how Norman Bowie can justify someone having an obligation or loyalty to one's own company, because he doesn't believe that is necessary in the business world, because he defines loyalty as a devotion to something more than persons, so something such as an abstract entity or another human being, not a company. From there, he moves on to Ladd, and Ladd also goes into talking about loyalty and is referring to loyalty as a relationship between 2 persons, and it can be a difference between a person or a group of persons. There's a loyalty, and he goes into talking about how there's loyalty. Is there loyalty to a group or just to its members as individuals, and how a group is nothing more than its individuals. So he's really going into depth about who and what deserves an individual's loyalty in the business world. And in talking about them, he talks about how a company or an organization can't be seen as something as a higher moral status, because as a higher moral status, um, you're deeming it not as a group but as a set of individuals, and that's not what a company is. A company simply is a group of individuals who divide labor to make a profit. That's simply what it is, and that's why it doesn't deserve loyalty from an individual, because loyalty from an individual is basically expecting someone to give more than they need to without any expected return being given back. And he goes into talking about how this example used earlier about blowing whistles on one's own team, as if the business world is a team and people work on teams and they're all shooting to win a game. It doesn't really apply to whistleblowing, because A, someone would never blow the whistle on their own team because that would jeopardize their team winning, and B, winning and losing in the business world is a lot more serious than in sports, such as losing in the business world has massive consequences, like loss of jobs and a loss of a company and tons of money, and where a loss in a soccer game is simply, oh, we lost, we'll try again next week. So he goes into talking about how that analogy is dangerous because it gives people the impression that like business is not as serious as it should be, and that's why blowing the whistle is bad, because it's like it's blowing the whistle on your own team, it's calling a foul on your own team, which doesn't apply at all, because in the real world you're preventing harm to the public, but in sports you're simply calling a foul on your own teammate. So those are some of the topics that were covered under the main topic of whistleblowing, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.